Perfect. So first, I wanted to thank the organizers. I know the challenges on this campus and many other campuses to put in an event like this and have an open debate and tackle issues like this one. So thank you for hosting us, and thanks for continuing GCGC. It's a hard one, you know, all over the world. So for everyone that to be here and to continue to do this. So I'm going to tackle a little bit what Boris talked about. What is the role of finance to save the planet? And the subtitle of the paper is, but we're going to turn from banks to institutional investors, and we're going to go from debt to equity here, mostly focused on publicly listed companies. And so the subtitle, the punchline is, institutional investors have commitments to tackle climate change through disclosure, but also through engagement. And what do we find in terms of their own actions, of their own portfolio, greening their portfolio, or are they helping green the planet? So that's the punchline is more of the first and not so much of the second. This is joint work with Vaska, who's a postdoc who's just finished her time at Darden, and Simon, who used to be a postdoc, is now at the Fed. So there's the same disclosure applies for the ECB, and then Philipp Krueger, who's in Geneva. So I think we are all, you know, in line with this topic. It's a challenging topic to decarbonize the economy, and the first best solution is nowhere close, right? The Pigouvian textbook solution is very hard to reach due to the political economy of this. This is a legacy issue of the developed economies, the Western economies, but the gradient is somewhere else now. You know, going forward, there are commitments to decarbonize, such as the European net zero by 2050. The U.S., as Boris pointed out, depends. You know, I've been here for a few years. They're somewhat trending down already, naturally decarbonizing, let's say, but the political commitments could swing just in November again. So, you know, not super clear whether that commitment is really there. And then if you look at China, which is 2x or 3x the absolute emissions, that is a much harder number to achieve to get to net zero. But even that, you know, even if China were to, you know, fully decarbonize, the other economies are taking up carbon emissions as they take up manufacturing from China and so forth. So that's the political economy. It's like we're really struggling on this, and therefore we're very likely not going to meet the 1.5 degree that the Paris Agreement set as a goal. Probably going to end up more like in 2 to 3 degrees, and there's no significant consequences, the science tells us, on this. But there's a kind of uncertainty, of course. We don't know all this. There's no such thing as certainty on this field. So the question is, how can public markets help address this question? And in particular, we're going to zone in on investor-led coalitions that tackle this crisis. The first thing is just to level set. Let's go back here. The carbon emissions per year. How does this work? Not very good. So on the right side, you have like 50 gigatons of emissions per year. Those are in the industrial, and some of them are, of course, land use. It's things that we cannot do much about. 30 to 40 of those are industrial emissions. And COVID was, you know, big shutdown. We didn't have 2 GCGCs, but there was a small bit, you know, deep in that, and that's come back, right? So it's very hard to abate these emissions. It's been truly an issue. How much of those 50 gigatons, as I said, there are some that are land use, forestry, agriculture, very hard to abate, but there are quite a lot of them that come from industrial processes. But how many of those would be attributable to publicly listed companies? And that's a very important number to begin with to, you know, assess the chances of investor initiatives on this. in that there's only 10 gigatons come directly from the direct operation. So I'm only talking scope 1 emissions, the direct operation. Of course, oil and gas companies have huge scope 3 emissions, and Apple and so forth, and ChatGPT and so forth. So many others will have that. But so even a company like ExxonMobil would be a drop in the ball, in the ocean of emissions. Those are the top emitting that get targeted by initiatives: oil and gas, utilities, and metals, and cement and chemicals, etc. Material sectors. But just be mindful that what are the chances going in? It's a fifth of the emissions if you're just targeting the direct emissions of those firms. So this paper will look into the decarbonization efforts of institutional investors. We look into 2 types of initiatives. The disclosure initiatives used to be called Carbon Disclosure Project. It's expanded its scope to forestry, water, etc. Now goes by CDP. Very successful, perhaps one of the most successful initiatives out there, because it actually leads to all the data that we're all using across many projects. And then with those, that information of who are the highest emitters, there's a second post-Paris initiative called Climate Action 100. It's expanded to beyond 100, but originally they targeted 100 largest from the CDP data. So you needed the data, need the first round of disclosure to even get to the second. And the second effort is more on action or engagement with those companies, having leading institutional investors deal with each of those companies. And then we ask how does these 2 things interact? The investor level initiatives, like a finance mechanism, versus the traditional mechanism would have been a carbon tax or carbon pricing scheme. And since there's different regions of the world, like the EU has an ETS, emission trading scheme, where 3.0 or 4.0, I lost count, it hasn't been super successful, but it is non-zero. So there are countries around the world where there's some carbon pricing, maybe less than what would be the full social cost. And then there are those like the US that has no federal carbon pricing. So you can contrast, regions of the world like that. Okay, so punchline on the results I'll read is we are able to look at the first 15 years with these initiatives and see that everyone is decarbonizing. The public markets are decarbonizing, so that 10 gigaton is actually shrinking over the years. But the question is, so if you naturally just benchmark to the index, you'll decarbonize. What we will be showing is that these investors that join these initiatives or support them, they're called signatories or members of these initiatives, they are decarbonizing at a faster rate. So by how much? About 3% faster. How much do you need? Really goes back to here. Like if you were back in the day, sorry, I cannot use this again, but to abate this, you need like 8 to 10% per year. And the more you delay this problem, it may become 10 or 11%. And if you delay it more and leave it to the last day, then it has to be 100%, right? So the more you delay it, the worse it gets to do so. So the 3 to 5% in our results are, statistically economically important numbers, but you have to keep in mind what is the problem you're dealing with. Then we also look at the interesting results that this investors that join the CDP actually take more action if they're part of countries based in countries that have rolled out carbon pricing schemes. And then how do they decarbonize? That's the subtitle of the paper, is they could take 2 routes. The first one is just to rebalance the way from the brown to green stocks in their portfolio, just by selling or divesting partially of those firms. Or they could stay invested, as in the previous paper we discussed, they could stay invested with the brown firms and make them less brown over time, engage with them through voice. And this is, most of the results line up with reweighting rather than voice, though there is, towards the end of our sample, Climate Action 100 and some first evidence of it takes time. It may be directed only at the top 100 as we show, and maybe just post-Paris. But overall, those are backward-looking measures of firms' greenness. We also look in the last part of the paper into forward-looking measures of greenness, which is whether firms are rolling out green solutions in the forms of green products and services. And this we use the EU new taxonomy of activities like renewables or EVs or whatnot that get labeled as green versus fossil fuel or combustion engines which get labeled as non-green. Large literature, I'll skip that in the interest of time and just go straight to this. So assemble the data on institutional holdings around the world and overlaid S&P true cost data. We've, as mentioned, focused most on direct emissions, but we also look into scope 2+3 in some robustness tests. First question, are institutional investors decarbonizing? This is the biggest takeaway I want you guys to take from this, is that if you slice that 30 to 40 gigatons that are industrial emissions, this is from not the US EDGAR, but the European EDGAR emissions database for atmospheric research. And that 30 gigatons, about 10 gigatons, as I mentioned, reside in public markets at the beginning. And given true cost has more coverage than the Economist article, that number goes to like 15 gigatons. And that is just the addition of China. A lot of other companies came public and so forth. But what is interesting is a lot of those shares of those firms that are high emitting are not held by institutional investors. Rather, they could be Saudi Aramco, who floated 90%, retained 90% still owned by the Saudis, and only 10% gets floated. So BlackRock may own only 1% of its emissions, let's say. If we apportion just the share that an investor has in a firm, then you'll see that currently institutional investors had 9% of the total, and they still only own 9% of the shares of those emissions, which is interesting. It's flat because institutional investors have grown their holdings. Institutional investors have grown from 43% of the market cap of the outstanding shares to 53% in market cap weighted, right? So they must be decarbonizing, right? Because you would have expected that they would have grown proportionally, right, their share of the emissions from 9 to 15% if you just do back up the envelope calculations. That's the first finding. The second is, do we look at the two types of institutional investors, not just, we compare BlackRock, who's joined CDP, or and then may have now pulled out of Climate Action 100, as you're all aware. Like we look at, we go through those that decided to join the CDP. CDP, as I said, was a disclosure mechanism where in the name of this group of institutional investors, companies get mailed questionnaires, and it became super successful in the sense that now we have 15,000 respondents to these surveys. And that is actually the core behind S&P True Cost. Any other data provider was that CDP was out there first, the survey, and now companies are voluntarily disclosing, and also they have some estimated data when such data is not available. And the second initiative is post-Paris. So it's more an engagement initiative, as I explained before. Grown to the point that half of the capital of equity holdings of investors now are by CDP members. So they have, supported this initiative. Climate Action 100 is still a smaller share of the capital. And then we look at, let's say the one on the right is what I just said for BlackRock. If BlackRock owns 1% of Saudi Aramco's shares, then we take its footprint, we portion 1% of Saudi Aramco's emissions to BlackRock. And we do the same for Exxon's holdings of BlackRock and for VW's holdings of BlackRock. And we aggregate up what is the aggregate footprint of BlackRock's entire equity portfolio, those trillions of dollars of equities, how much gigatons, which is less, or millions of tons, do they finance, let's say. And on the right-hand side, you see what is the average firm they're financing or investing through equities. And that's also, trending down. But the market, the MSCI equity is also naturally trending down. So the question is going to be the orange versus the blue, meaning those that join CDP and those that did not, do they decarbonize any faster? So the regression is very simple. It's just a sum. On the left-hand side is the delta, the growth in emissions that you're investing through your portfolio, and the variable of interest is just a symbol, dummy yes or no, are you part of this or not? And so that's where the 2 to 3% number comes from, is if controlling for many other things like investor characteristics, the region, and et cetera. What is the difference in the loading on the decarbonization rate of the portfolio? And that's like a 2 to 3% higher rate. The third question is then, how do this decarbonization rates interact with the rollout of carbon pricing? Do you act faster in decarbonizing your portfolio if you're an investor based out of Europe because EU is rolling out the ETS, or out of the US where there isn't? I'll just skip quickly to say that the largest emissions trading scheme in the world is Europe, ETS. In Japan since 2012 or 11, I should say, South Korea, and then there's others, and China would be the largest after that, but it's outside our sample period. And so we just flag those investors that are based out of those regions versus the other regions. And so if you split the sample, the decarbonization rate is faster in the emission scheme base by 3 to 4% against the 7 to 8% that one would have needed back in the day. And there's no finding outside those regions. Finally, how are they decarbonizing? This is the punchline. The second punchline of the paper is, as I said, are you mostly reducing states in the high emitters and rebalancing towards the greener stocks, the lower emitters, just by selling out? So let's say you're a European investor and you divest or rebalance out of the high emitters. And guess what? Who's buying? American investors, right? Because our secondary shares, they're not primary shares being issued by the firm, but rather just trading in secondary markets, which we call greening your portfolio. Or do you find that no, European investors are staying invested, maybe like their banks, with the brown firms to help them with the transition from brown to less brown over time, which would label greening the planet or helping that. Now, the first one be, there still could be an effect through the cost of capital, of course. And on the second one, we're thinking more the incentive and enabling the transition. This paper doesn't go that extra step to test that, but that's fundamentally the two. And the way we do that is look at the total change, and we decompose how much of that total change was deltas in weights, just rebalancing your portfolio. How much of that total change was if you kept the weights, so you stayed invested, but the firms, the delta is coming from the corporates' change in emissions. And that's simple decomposition. And the punchline is most of the results are on the reweighting side, not so much on the corporate changes. And again, interact with emission schemes. I have 2 minutes. I'll just pick a few things to give you a flavor, and you can take a look at the paper. One is, this might take time. So the first thing is, should it be directed to the top 100? Yes, we find that's true, and that's how climate action came about. It could be that you need time for the corporate actions to take place. And this could have been more pairs. So I think we should continue working on this topic. And this is just, think about this as decarbonization 1.0, the first 15 years. But we should keep, it's just getting later and later to address the problem. But the first 15 years would be mostly greening your portfolio. Last thing, do I have a minute? Okay, there's another paper that can start now. The second paper would be, what if we don't look into emissions, but rather forget emissions, think about the solutions. And I have a new paper with Philipp Krueger on green revenues and so forth. So I direct you there for SSRN if you want to look into that. And that is using what's called the green revenues data, which the originally FTSE had developed for going back many years, but now it's also factors in the EU taxonomy that's come live the last 2-3 years, or the solutions in the form of climate patents or green patents, which has been used by other work like Cohen and so forth. So take a look if you want. I know you're looking at me, so I should close. There's nothing much here happening. Investors still don't seem to be factoring in those patents. And if anything, they're just riding the wave on green revenues, but not helping companies convert into green. My takeaways, mostly greening the portfolio, not necessarily greening the planet. Very much looking forward to the feedback from Marco. Thanks again.
Okay, I'll start anyway because I know the first slide what I'm going to say. So this is a Pedro paper. Pedro is one of the people who knows most about institutional ownership or ownership by institutional investors in the world. And it was kind of the obvious paper to write because you add carbon and how much carbon is in their portfolios to your knowledge. So this was the paper to write. Now, is it important? It's clearly extremely important, and it's very good to have this paper. Now, as Pedro said, it really does two things. So it looks at one channel, which is that you decarbonize your portfolio by reweighting or whatever, and then the other channel, which is that you engage. So that's it. So the way the measurement is done is that if you reweight, the way that you then do this is you change your portfolio in order to manage risk or do something else. If you engage, actually, you might keep the companies you have in your portfolio, and what your objective is, you want them to decarbonize. So that's quite two different mechanisms. And my first comment is I'm not quite sure how you distinguish between these two things in the paper. Now, the second thing, and I've underlined this, is you frame it as the Hart-Zingales-Brocado problem, voice versus exit. I'll argue that that's the wrong way of framing it. These two things are actually not mutually exclusive, but you can usefully combine them. But that's going to be my last comment. So I'm not going to tell you again why it's important. By the way, this chart that shows you CO2 concentration and temperature is not going to stay linear. At Imperial College, there's a person called Eric who depresses people by showing you a video about a discontinuity. So at some point there might be a discontinuity, and he estimates, I think, Claudia, it's 8 or 10 degrees jump or something like this. When permafrost defrosts, it's depressing. Anyway, let's not, it's too early in the morning to talk about this. Now, it's urgent, so people don't realize how radical and fast we've got to go. And then you look at the pledges that people have made. This comes from TPI. These are the stuff in the solid lines. This is the oil and gas industry. Is how much they've done already. If you can't see anything there, that's because they haven't done anything. And then you have the Americans and, of course, Saudi Aramco, who tell you, we promise you, we are going to do nothing. And then you have BP and the other Europeans who say, we promise you, we are going to do a lot and we are going to go to zero. Do we believe that? Okay, up to you. It's definitely a risk. Now, the blue areas are actually the pledges. This is the deep blue is Paris. So these are called national pledges. Paris is not that ambitious. Paris is not sufficient to go to 1.5 or even to 2. We've got to go on a much lower path. So that's just a reminder of where we are. So is this a risk? Yes, it is. There is, of course, a risk of not doing this because the the physical damage might be huge. There's also a risk if actually people go through and push you on this path and you are somebody who says, I'm not even promising you to do something, you might be out of business. Rob Englert calls this termination risk. That's really what we are talking about. When you talk about this, it might not happen, but it's definitely a risk. So why do investors want to decarbonize, if you are familiar with this picture? And there are really two things here. One is a moral imperative. I'm just stressing this because if you think there's a moral thing here, you don't care about what Pedro says, whether your actions actually have an impact or not. You just do it because you dissociate yourself from people who destroy the planet. So that's just, a very straightforward reason why you want to decarbonize. And then there's an addition to this. You might also do this in order to make a statement. Columbia University divested, and so did Stanford, from the Carbon Underground 200 because they wanted to make a statement that they think what these companies are doing is wrong. Together with Anne Pajust and Anne Pignolo, we call this voice through divestment. It's about making a statement. That's not really what Pedro's paper is about. The paper says it's about managing transition and termination risk. And then, as I said, it looks at these two channels. One is decarbonize your portfolio, and the other one is engage. Now, did they choose the right kind of setting? So as far as the engagement goes, I think they've chosen the right thing to study. Climate Action 100 Plus is the global engagement consortium on carbon. They could have chosen the more recent one, Net Zero Engagement Initiative, but that's only March 2023, so that really doesn't work. So I think that's the right thing to study. Now, CDP, I'm really not sure, Pedro, because CDP is now, it's a disclosure protocol. Okay, maybe in the beginning people set it up. We do have these net zero alliances. So there's Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, Paris Aligned Asset Owners. So you might just as well put, those into, you have enough, put those into the dummy variable. I think that would be more interesting to see. Also note here, and you didn't really talk about this, there's a question, of course, of double counting. You have asset owners there, we're pretty sure. Asset managers, whose money is it actually? You could be counting the asset owner's money again being managed by the asset managers. Now, let me start then going a bit more into depth on the portfolio decarbonization and ask what's the right benchmark. So what you do in the paper is you say, I'm comparing CDP to something else. And CDP is more net zero than the rest. I've just argued that I don't think that's that good distinction. So could you use a better benchmark? I think you could, but that's another paper. There are two proposals at the moment of what the best way is to decarbonize a portfolio. Patrick Bolton is associate and Marcin Kopurczyk, so it's again Imperial, associated with both of them. One suggestion is you take current emissions and you basically kick out the people with the highest emissions sequentially from your portfolio. Marcin has another paper that says you have actually got to look forward, so we take into account their promises, but that's more complicated. So if you look at Patrick's paper with Marcin and Fred Samama, they have a list. So you take, for example, the oil and gas industry, you take those with the highest emissions and you kick them out first, and you have a kind of exit map, and then you go and you kick them out, and you adjust this every time because you know what the carbon budget is every year, and you also know who the highest carbon emitters are and so forth. So that's the way you do it. Now, the useful thing is that S&P have, because Fred Samama now works at S&P, they've got an index product that does this. It's not completely simple because it goes by vintages. So they've started with this vintage. So this comes from wine. I don't know whether that's a good analogy they could have chosen. This vintage says if you start decarbonizing in 2022, you've got to go 10% per year. Obviously, if you go next year, you've got to go faster. Now, this could be a benchmark for you. The unfortunate thing is they only reported from 2022 onwards, but the methodology is there. So you could do earlier vintages and say, well, if these people had really tried to decarbonize, what would they've needed to do? And then you have a benchmark and you can actually use all your observations to benchmark against that, and then you'll see whether there's greenwashing or not, and is this relevant? Yeah, because this is a brand new headline, so this fits with the first paper. ESMA has just come out with a new report, so greenwashing is not just a bank thing. The asset managers in Europe have done this as well, and Morningstar estimates that if you hold people accountable to what they actually say they do in terms of decarbonization, you need a 40 billion divestment based on what they do, or they need to change, of course, their advertising. Now, is the carbon emissions scheme, is that the most important variable? I would have chosen actually the sovereign pledges to net zero. You have these, they are available from Net Zero Tracker. It's a dummy variable, it's by country, and it also goes by region and by actually city. Now that brings me to the other point. You kind of almost want to check if California, New York State have made a net zero pledge. Is the New York State pension fund actually decarbonizing in line with what the state has pledged to do? And in some sense, we are at a law school that then comes back to the political question, who actually instructs the asset owner to do what it is they do? And you would think that if California has pledged to net zero, that then CalPERS and CalSTRS should actually be decarbonizing their portfolio in line with California's net zero pledge. The other thing, of course, Jeff said at the beginning, the exciting thing about this conference is that we bring law together with finance, interesting questions and political questions. Of course, in the US, this picture, you have to ask the opposite question, which you can also maybe ask, is what about the anti-ESG states? Okay, so are they decarbonizing less than the rest? In some sense, you should observe the opposite. They should recarbonize. They should stock up on Exxon and whatever. I mean, this is the sort of implication, okay, doubling down, go long on Saudi Aramco. Yeah, great idea. Okay, so anyway, so that again is available very usefully. As usual in the US, you have great data, so there are dummy variables there. Now, turning to Climate Action 100 Plus, it depresses me, okay, because I'm an engagement person. I thought this was a great idea. There was engine number one, okay, so this is Climate Action 100 Plus. Now, this is their 2023, so they do progress updates. So this is their 2023 progress update. They have 11 indicators. Now, the one on the left looks brilliant because it looks pretty green, okay? That's their assessment of the forward-looking stuff. So that's what people have promised. So they've promised a lot of stuff and they've achieved people to make promises to them. Now, if you look on the other side, indicator 11, that's historic emissions. That's pretty orange and red, okay? So they've not really managed to get Exxon to change in any way. If anything, Exxon have shown them at the AGM just a few weeks ago. I don't know what they showed them, but they basically told them, we've sued Follow This, we are doubling down, we don't really care what you people have to say to us. And if you then look at CapEx, which is, I think, the better indicator, which comes from Carbon Tracker, that's really red. Now, the only thing is Boris, a carbon exit from coal in the form of power plants. There they claim something green, but I think that's more your paper. I mean, that could be the explanation. There could not be the Climate Action 100 Plus at all. It could be the defunding of coal-fired power plants that you show in your paper. So they might claim a green thing here, which has nothing to do with Climate Action 100 Plus, but comes from what you document in your paper. Now, is this politically relevant? Yes, it is. Okay, so this week, if you really want to geek out, you now have 2 hours of grillings in front of the Climate Control Committee, where now Climate Action 100 Plus has been accused of being a cartel. It's really interesting to listen to, including the Chief Investment Officer of CalPERS. Clearly, they didn't achieve very much so far, but they've really annoyed some people. Okay, so they're being dragged in front of the policymakers now. Now, turning to California, that's also really an amazing story, because you have the people who push for divestment there, but they don't push for decarbonization. They push for making a statement on the Carbon Underground 200, whereas on the other hand, CalPERS and CalSTRs, they're not willing to really decarbonize, but they say, we want to stay invested because we want to keep engaging with these people. And if you listen to them, they said, oh, actually, we keep invested. We are still invested in the US petroleum industry and all of that. It's really a pretty strange position to take. I really don't understand what CalPERS and CalSTRs are doing, to be honest. Now, turning to my final point of combining divestment with engagement, there is a prescription or a blue sheet from Share Action in London of an escalation strategy, which basically means you first talk, then you vote, and if they don't listen to you, you divest, and ideally you do that very publicly. Now, the people who have done that very consistently are the Church of England. So they have first engaged for years with the oil and gas industry. They voted against, in favor of resolutions. And then very recently, as this Financial Times article showed, they've said, you've promised us a lot. You've not done anything. We've now had enough. We are leaving. And they've said this very publicly. This is exactly what the oil and gas industry does not want to happen. This is exactly why they're lobbying for people to continue to engage with them. So I think you can really combine these two things. But of course, tracking something like this in your data is extremely difficult. So I'll actually conclude here. So I think it's a great paper. I could really think of another 3 papers that you can write based on your paper, including involving some of our friends from law schools. But that's why we are here. And this is just the final slide to remind ourselves that it's really urgent. We don't have much time. And if you look at, that we had the warmest year on record this year in every single month, it's really quite urgent. But, maybe well, anyway, so I'll just stop there.
Okay, so thank you, Marco. So please first respond.
Thank you. And I think between us, we can do like 3-5 papers. So let's do that. So yeah, I highly recommend the work on voice through divestment. That I think there's more we could do there. Why CDP? Cheap answer is we can go further back, but the more fundamental reason is not you measuring a problem. You start measuring the problem. So disclosures, by seeking disclosure, now you will have the data to deal with the problem. And there's no commitment, no ask from CDP that you have to deal with the problem, but you start observing the problem. So that was the kind of the genesis. But I agree, I think we pulled the trigger and started working on this just to see whether that first mechanism worked or how was it playing out. But I think as we upgrade the paper and update the paper, we can definitely look into Climate Action 100, which is the more directed one. And then the net zero, where Climate Action 100 is now this. You guys are lawyers. You can correct me if I'm wrong. This acting in concert and this concern around whether these things can even take place here. But net zero, number of them pulled out. So Vanguard pulled out and so forth. So it's really interesting to study. Maybe depressing on one side, but very interesting from another perspective. The benchmark, the third question on benchmark, that's really well put. I wish we had all this going back, but we'll definitely look back to see what would have been possible to estimate as the right benchmark to decarbonize, and how we do have some data also on the targets that are disclosed to the CDP, and also just a flag if you're SBTI or not. Like And as at the beginning of time, there's very little, but later there is some data. So it would be good to see the pledges and sort of the forward-looking versus the historical, what's happening in the portfolio. So many other things. So I definitely wanted to thank Marco for enlightening me, and I thought the discussion was pretty good to bring me up to speed myself, and I'm guessing many others are nodding as I say this, that we should all be embracing these topics and not shying away from them. All we could do in this paper was maybe just one small take at it. I'll let you run the session.
Okay, so thank you so much. So now the floor is open. So first Jill and then Dan.
Thanks. So this is a great paper. I wonder if it's worth thinking a little bit more about the institutional context, particularly in the United States, in light of what Marco said about the importance of what's going on in the U.S. and oil companies and so forth. So in particular, you might look at this lawsuit that Exxon has filed against one of its institutional investors, essentially claiming that the institutional investor is trying to damage the company by engaging with it to reduce its carbon emissions. And there are an awful lot of institutional investors that are obviously going to feel constrained by even the threat of litigation. So, is that a partial explanation for why you see divestment rather than engagement?
Yeah. And so we have started coding the ropes in gray. I'm not very good in my law firm, but they have a nice tracker on those. It's just maybe the threat. Many of them are not enacted, but they start coming in. They start coming in, as far as I could tell, from 21 to 22 onwards, so a little bit outside this. But I think, this is something Marco mentioned, that we should keep expanding the analysis period here. And eventually, you can tell me whether that's at the state level, is this being more at the federal level where we have DOL going back and forth and the Biden veto and so forth on this thing. So as lawyers, would you say we should do it at the state level, at the federal level? Which one would you, Jill? Putting on the state level. Yeah, at the state level, you have this anti-ESG policies, and at the federal level, you have the whether institutional investors can incorporate the ERISA, DOL. At the okay. 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 Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, great paper, Pedro. I think in terms of engagement, you brought up that this result you're not seeing a lot of engagement is of course incredibly important, and you brought up in the paper that acting in concert is a problem in the U.S. But if you look around the world, you'll find that actually acting in concert is a problem everywhere. Okay. In terms of institutional investors legally coming together. So actually, Umar Khan and I have done a recent paper on this. And so I think your intuition is definitely correct. But of course, as you know, Climate 100 has investors everywhere, right? So you may want to, I think this could provide another legal reason to strengthen or to justify the results that you've seen, which I think are correct, yeah.
And is there a time variation? Like, as an empiricist, would I have a shock I can use somewhere?
Yeah, we'll have to think about about that, Jersey. Yeah,
but definitely
we'll talk later. Yeah, but
thank you.
So Uwe, I think you have a question, and then.
Okay, thanks a lot for this very great paper. I'm struggling a little bit, Pedro, with your analysis on the interaction between the private and public policies you have in your paper. Given that I suspect that investors have a home bias in their portfolios, do your results simply stress that public policies are working and that's what you're observing? And given that related issue, given that, for instance, ETS is covering only partial segments of the industry, certain industries, couldn't you exploit that heterogeneity and really look into the detailed mechanism of it?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Both good questions. So yeah, we're looking into the first one. We didn't. I said Marco will present this version, not the next version, but the next version of the paper splits your home portfolio, particularly like if that portfolio is in an emissions trading scheme, and stocks you may hold outside or foreign portfolio, if you like, that are not affected. And we find that the decarbonization happens faster in the stocks that are affected by carbon pricing, let's say, but not to the granularity that you're suggesting, which is great. ETS is not all sectors of the economy, so we could go even further.
So a couple points. Okay. One of which, why the focus on oil and gas firms? They produce fuel, but the question is who uses the fuel,
Pedro,
right?
yes.
So, and I'm just thinking the policy of the U.S. and Europe to basically impose high tariffs on Chinese EVs will presumably have emission effects of some huge amount, which somehow don't play a role in the policy debate, right? So the question, you know, with all respect, is by looking at oil and gas, in a sense, we're not paying sufficient attention to the transition away from, and what are the factors that accelerate or decelerate, essentially, the reduction in demand for those fuels. And so a huge amount of energy on these particular firms seems to be a diversion away from the transition path away from their use, which are industrial policy issues, political issues, and perhaps are not so amenable to portfolio selection and engagement with oil and gas firms, but nevertheless are perhaps mission critical if the goal is to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, and Marco wants to speak.
Well, I hope you're going to do. It's decarbonizing. It doesn't mean oil and gas. So a cement company that's a high carbon emitter would get eliminated from the portfolio as well. So it's about high carbon.
High-powered discussion around the Church of England,
right? No. Well,
getting rid of, cement firms from the portfolio.
Yes, no, that's what it's about. You would get rid of the high.
So
you would get rid of cement firms that are not on a path to zero.
So oil and gas in the first, in the first picture from The Economist, oil and gas is a sliver, and then it's materials, so chemicals, cement, etc., and it's also utilities, right? And but to your larger point, I think I can disagree with. The carbon footprint of like blocking China, cheap solar, cheap EVs, cheap, all these solutions we can take so cheap is preventing, our meaning US or European transition. So if I can do a plug for the next paper, our next paper, which we posted a week or 2 weeks at SSRN, is the green transition. And through this new data that's become available of like labeling which ones, there was a task force the EU had to identify which ones are aligned with transition, which ones are not. So EVs would count, but say combustion engine would not. So splitting like Toyota might be 30% because they have some hybrid and some EVs, and then Volkswagen maybe 5 or 10%, and Tesla maybe 100% in this green revenues metric. We can see how is it scaling up and how it's ramping up, but it may not be fast enough. So there's two-pronged effort. You have to abate emissions because the planet doesn't still that we have a budget to exhaust. And the second is, do we have a solution to replace, right? And so I think we need to look into both things. And we're not seeing, so China is a big part of the green economy, right, in terms of those new products and solutions. But they're also popping elsewhere, and so I think we should be looking into that as well. Yeah.
I've seen many hands going up, so let's collect some questions,
Okay,
and we'll let you decide which ones to answer. So first, Kobe.
Hi, this is really interesting. So some of those institutional investors, including the big three that you mentioned in the paper, have passive funds, passive index funds. So have you distinguished between the passive and the active? Do you see divestment in the passive as well? I mean, they have some ESG funds, but it's a small fraction of their business. And if we see any divestment there, how? I guess some of it can happen through brown spinning, so the public companies became private. Have you control for that as well? So this is...
And then, okay. Yeah. Yes, so put on your mic.
So I'm going to complain about something other than not my inability to push the right button. It's funny that this notion of focusing on decision makers in order for them to respond to some set of incentives. All of this builds on a huge literature on takeovers, where we've got a big backlog, and there are efforts to design how we ought to pay whoever's making what choices. But here, there's not much going on how are mutual funds paying portfolio managers? How are banks turning? E2, the large original Italian provider, who were holding themselves out as extremely green in the way they finance their business, they all got fired. It seems to me that it might be interesting, and so I'm talking to myself as well as everybody else, is focusing on how the decision maker, ultimately, whether it's the individual investor, CalPERS, the governor of California running maybe for president, why aren't we shaping it where we shaped it when we wanted to turn the whole company over? And I don't see that we're focusing on the decision makers whose choices drive the charts. And I think we learned a lot from that. Does it fit?
Okay, so Lee.
Maybe I'm asking a more philosophical question here. I think, as Boris mentioned in the earlier comment to the previous paper, here the question really is: does finance matter for reducing climate control issues, or more specifically, do institutional investors matter? And the answer seems to be yes, but only to a certain extent. Or maybe I should rephrase my comment and say, are we asking too much of our institutional investor friends? As maybe the previous comments were saying, climate control is important, but it's only one dimension of the so many things that we care about. So when it comes to other, maybe more pressing needs, like fighting inflations, job creations, or even like, as Jeffrey was talking about before, like the trade war between China and Europe and United States, EV, for example, or solar or wind energies. China actually is trying to do a lot, but these things are actually probably not the highest priority in the current issue, the geopolitical situation with decoupling, de-risk. So a lot of these things going on at the same time. How can we ask our institutional investors to just focus on only controlling the temperature, even though it's a very important thing? It's probably not the top priority for a lot of these institutional investors. So how can you factor those other things into your empirical specifications? And also, as people were mentioning earlier, there are two things, alternatives: the the divesting strategy versus the engagement strategy. I think we probably all agree that in the long term, it's more effective to actually engage these big polluters. But it seems that institutions are taking the easier route because there's so much of a resistance. You could even get sued, as one of the previous commenter was talking about. So is this the right approach as we tackle the climate problem? I don't have the answer. You seem to find empirical evidence that engagement doesn't really have any effect. So institutional investors are choosing the easy route. But maybe that's something that I think is disappointing for me. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Arthur, please.
Thank you. One lawyer's question: how do you define domicile?
Okay.
I think it relates to Kobe's question whether you capture BlackRock and others. So the question is whether you look at BlackRock Ireland is different than BlackRock United States. And the second question is, you find that based on domicile, you can affect and the extent to which that country has carbon emission regulation, that's going to be more effective. So the question is, what does that tell us about the competing theories about what drives institutional investors for carbon emission reduction? So does it tell us, for example, that it's not really about the risk involved with carbon emissions, it's only about being socially conscious, and then the domicile is a proxy for political approach, or is it about different investor demand? So the question is whether something in your data can help us to do that.
Pierre?
So just a clarification about whether probably you don't have time, you can tell more about engagement. How do you estimate that? Because if I understand correctly from your presentation, it's just an ex post measure whether portfolio companies are decarbonizing. So, and you infer from that there's been some kind of engagement behind. But couldn't that be selection too, that they are actually choosing companies that are on track to decarbonization? And maybe this is even overestimates the actual engagement strategy of your sample.
I think you have 3 minutes to answer.
Let me start from the end. And yes, you're absolutely right. And we don't have what Marco had, like the ideal data would have been the engagement, the private communications, and all the things that happen at the investor level. We can, however, do better on what was the pathway, which Marco also brought up, and see to what extent a firm is falling behind its commitments, which we didn't do as well. But yeah, it's all indirect. It's not that granular. Now, that doesn't mean others shouldn't do that, and we shouldn't do that in a different paper, but we weren't, at this scale, we are not doing that. Domicile, I agree. So we have kind of a choice because BlackRock sells all over the world. BlackRock is not just the US. We can do it at the fund level, at the institutional level, or at the parent level. And those choices are not inconsequential because you could fear litigation here as a BlackRock, surely is working through private litigation, state level, all this, and federal. But then they also have clients elsewhere around the world. And so it would be good to study how they deal with this in different geographies. Asking your question of, is this a priority or not? We saw a bit of a change around Paris, but with Ukraine and many other things, inflation, and you brought up trade wars and so forth, and anti-ESG, this could then go back burner. So it would be good to study that. We do see a change in 15, 17, but maybe it would be good to study more recent what's happening. Incentives, great point. We don't have, again, the granular data at the manager level or the beneficiary level, who the this asset owner or this investment asset managers working for. We don't have that, but we can, and there are some papers on the rollout of the greenness or the labeling of products, particularly in Europe. There's Articles 6, 8, and 9, and so we could study that, like as these things get labeled, and there's more of that, but I don't have that granular data at the manager level. And then big three, I think I didn't skip anyone. And big three, there's two ways. There's a footnote in the paper, which is like, we remove them and the results. And you're like, Pedro, don't do that, because that's like 3 observations, right? And our unit of observation is an investor. If we take BlackRock as a single entity, it would be 1, State Street another one, and Vanguard the third one. But in dollar terms, they're huge, right? So the fact that they, as you said, they don't have ESG options, or those options don't take much traction. Their investors are not. I've visited Vanguard, and they said, well, we have 50 million clients, and we do offer an ESG option. No one seems to want to take it. It's not, and we do have, a climate aligned, etc. So we should study the economics of this, not just treating this as a single observation in an OLS, but weighting these observations. That is, they might, they're taking a huge market share that is not carbon aligned, and then it falls on the active ones to be more carbon aligned. So a lot of interesting questions, I think, with the brain power of all the women and men here. I hope we can take, and I think we need some coffee, right? So that's